The volatile landscape of the Nancy Guthrie investigation has been completely upended by a devastating administrative schism that threatens to permanently derail the pursuit of justice. Tonight, the foundational premise of this entire case is hanging by a thread following a series of conflicting disclosures that have turned a high-stakes kidnapping response into a masterclass in institutional dysfunction. For weeks, the public operated under the chilling assumption that an 84-year-old woman was being held captive by ruthless extortionists demanding millions of dollars for her safe return. That narrative, which dictated every tactical deployment and forensic focus across multiple jurisdictions, was shattered in a matter of minutes when high-level intelligence sources leaked a definitive assessment claiming the primary ransom demands were nothing more than an elaborate fabricated hoax. The immediate consequence of this revelation has been nothing short of catastrophic for the integrity of the operation, effectively pulling the rug out from under an anxious nation and plunging the victim's family into a nightmare of unprecedented scrutiny. If the very messages that sparked this massive federal and state mobilization are fraudulent, then the entire investigative apparatus has been chasing ghosts while the actual perpetrators managed to slip into the shadows completely unnoticed. The explosive controversy ignited on the international stage during a tightly controlled federal press briefing that was supposed to project absolute authority and clarity. Instead, the proceedings offered a stark visual manifestation of bureaucratic panic and evasion. When directly confronted with independent journalistic reports asserting that the ransom notes had been conclusively ruled fake by technical analysts, the highest level official at the Federal Bureau chose absolute evasion over transparency. Rather than delivering a definitive confirmation or a measured denial to steady a panicking public, the director exhibited classic indicators of defensive discomfort, shifting weights, glancing away from the press corps, and abruptly shutting down the line of inquiry with a highly practiced, dismissive formula. By stating that the agency would not comment on active field intelligence and emphasizing that their involvement was strictly limited to a secondary supportive capacity, the federal leadership effectively washed their hands of a rapidly escalating public relations disaster. This calculated retreat from the podium did not just signal a breakdown in institutional confidence. It exposed a massive, deep-seated rift between local investigators who have been operating on the front lines and the elite federal units tasked with processing the digital trail. This high-stakes game of administrative hot potato has exposed a shocking lack of cohesion at the absolute apex of law enforcement. While the Federal Bureau publicly retreats behind the shield of jurisdictional boundaries, characterizing the entire multi-agency effort as a localized state matter, the leadership at the county level has explicitly countered that narrative with their own timeline of events. According to local command structures, a clear division of labor was established at the very inception of the crisis, under which local deputies secured the primary physical perimeter and collected trace biological evidence, while the entirety of the digital correspondence and written demands was immediately handed over to elite federal cyber units for advanced forensic decryption. The stark contradiction between these two official stances leaves the public with a deeply unsettling realization that the right hand of the law has no concept of what the left hand is executing. The structural breakdown is not merely a matter of bruised professional egos or mismanaged public relations. It represents a systemic failure that directly compromises the golden hours of a critical missing persons case where every single second dictates the boundary between survival and tragedy. Amidst this chaotic back and forth between competing agencies, the immediate human toll of these administrative missteps has manifested as a brutal torrent of public hostility directed squarely at the victim's immediate family. In the hyper-reactive arena of modern media, the moment official entities hint that a ransom demand might be fabricated, the vacuum of verified information is instantly filled by malicious speculation and unverified theories. For weeks, the family has endured the unimaginable agony of a missing matriarch, only to find themselves suddenly recast in the court of public opinion, not as grieving relatives, but as potential architects of a grand deception. The public narrative has shifted with terrifying speed, fueled by online commentators who dissect every public appearance, every historical family dynamic, and every minor timeline discrepancy to build a case for internal involvement. The agonizing irony is that the very authorities who initially validated these communications as credible lifelines have now, through their own careless and contradictory signaling, unleashed a wave of societal judgment that effectively punishes the victims for a crisis they did not create. The center of this analytical storm revolves around the sheer specificity of the details contained within those initial disputed transmissions. Experienced investigators know that true criminal extortion demands rarely emerge from a vacuum. They are almost always weaponized with intimate insider knowledge designed to shock the recipients into absolute compliance. In the Guthrie case, the early communiques featured highly sensitive, non-public details regarding the internal state of the household on the night of the disappearance. The author of those documents possessed precise knowledge concerning the exact physical placement of personal electronic devices, including a specific wearable watch found discarded at the foot of the bedding, as well as the exact style of sleepwear the victim was wearing when she was last seen alive. Furthermore, the messages detailed structural anomalies at the residence, such as a malfunctioning exterior security floodlight that had been subtly shifted off its axis to create a blind spot in the property's surveillance perimeter. These are not elements that a random, opportunistic cybercriminal could simply guess or extrapolate from public records. They point definitively to an individual who either possessed direct physical access to the domestic environment in the immediate aftermath of the event, or who was intimately familiar with the daily operational vulnerabilities of the estate, a reality that explains why the sudden declaration of a hoax has turned the spotlight of suspicion so aggressively back toward the inner circle. This operational whiplash is further complicated by the public statements of the victim's adult daughter, highly trained legal analyst who has built a career on objective evidence evaluation and prosecutorial strategy. Her public insistence that the initial demands were fundamentally credible was not the emotional reaction of a distraught relative. It was a measured assessment from a professional, completely unaccustomed to being deceived by criminal subterfuge. Her subsequent willingness to publicly offer massive, unnegotiated financial sums, not for a guarantee of life, but simply for the return of her mother's physical remains, suggests that the family had received a secondary, far more dark transmission that completely altered their operational calculus. This hidden sequence of events paints a picture of a kidnapping plot that went catastrophically wrong in its opening hours, forcing the perpetrators into a panic-driven retreat where they abandoned their financial ambitions and shifted entirely towards self-preservation and forensic evasion. As the federal apparatus attempts to execute an aggressive, midstream course correction to account for these shifting realities, the delicate balance between tactical deception and public transparency has been utterly shattered, leaving the true fate of the missing matriarch buried beneath a mountain of bureaucratic spin and unresolved digital anomalies. The strategic calculus behind this sudden, highly coordinated reversal by the Federal Bureau is increasingly viewed by intelligence analysts not as a symptom of internal chaos, but as a calculated psychological operation designed to break an ongoing investigative stalemate. In high-stakes abduction scenarios, especially those involving vulnerable elderly victims, where the traditional timeline for financial leverage has long since expired, standard investigative protocols often give way to aggressive countermeasures. When an operation runs completely out of actionable digital leads, when proxy servers, encrypted networks, and sophisticated digital scrubbing techniques have successfully masked the physical origin of the ransom demands, authorities are frequently forced to manufacture a crisis of confidence within the criminal enterprise itself by weaponizing the international media to broadcast a definitive declaration that the ransom notes are entirely fraudulent. The Federal Bureau may be intentionally trying to bait the actual perpetrators into a reckless reactionary response. A narcissistic or panicked criminal, seeing their leverage completely dismissed on the global stage, is highly likely to break cover and transmit an unforced, highly detailed secondary communication to reestablish their dominance and validate their demands. This tactical deployment of intentional misinformation is a completely legal and highly effective maneuver within the broader framework of deep cover domestic operations. Throughout the history of modern federal law enforcement, the utilization of deceptive public narratives has served as a vital tool to force the hand of fugitives who have successfully vanished behind a wall of operational security. To understand the psychological mechanisms at play, one only needs to examine the classic structural models of public stings, where authorities leverage the media to broadcast false information regarding an ongoing case to manipulate the behavioral patterns of their prime suspects. Whether it is a manufactured public notice claiming an elusive felon has won a high-value promotional sweepstakes, or the intentional leaking of falsified forensic conclusions to defense teams to see how they adapt their legal positioning, the objective remains entirely identical: to disrupt the target's sense of security. In the Guthrie case, by forcing the narrative that the state and federal entities no longer take the written demands seriously, investigators are actively applying psychological pressure, forcing the author of those messages to decide whether to remain silent and lose their financial prize, or to communicate once more and risk stepping directly into a microscopic digital trap. The technical infrastructure required to execute and monitor such a complex trap relies on a profound understanding of modern digital forensics and network topology. Every single electronic transmission, regardless of how deeply it is routed through anonymizing layers or global virtual private networks, leaves a highly distinct digital envelope that can be forensically reconstructed under ideal conditions. When a cybercriminal utilizes a specific Internet Protocol address to launch an extortion campaign, they are essentially leaving a structural fingerprint across the global routing infrastructure. Even if the immediate technical analysis only traces the message back to a broad geographic territory, a commercial service provider, or a public access hub like a municipal library or an apartment complex, that data provides federal units with a definitive physical anchor. Once that physical perimeter is established, the implementation of advanced localized network monitoring allows tactical units to watch the point of origin with extreme precision. If the psychological bait succeeds and the perpetrator returns to that exact geographic node to send a defiant follow-up message confirming their control over the situation, they will be executing that transmission on a network that has been completely compromised and mapped by federal counterintelligence. The profound complexity of this digital dragnet has naturally led to widespread confusion regarding the true origin of the various electronic missives that have flooded the communication channel since the inception of the case. Investigative records indicate that a clear demarcation must be made between the primary, localized ransom notes and the subsequent wave of opportunistic digital communications that routinely plague high-profile missing persons investigations. In any case where a massive financial reward is publicly advertised, the operation is immediately besieged by digital vultures and cybernetic parasites, individuals with zero connection to the physical crime who utilize public details to manufacture secondary extortion schemes in the hope of securing a swift cryptocurrency payoff. While early media reports erroneously claimed that every single piece of electronic correspondence originated from an identical singular Internet Protocol address, advanced forensic separation has proved otherwise. The initial detail-rich ransom demands that established the baseline for the kidnapping investigation emerged from entirely distinct, highly obscured network nodes, confirming that investigators are dealing with a dual-front challenge, tracking down the actual, highly organized perpetrators, while systematically filtering out the noise generated by global opportunistic extortionists. This intense convergence of technical surveillance and psychological warfare places an unprecedented burden of proof on forensic psychologists who are tasked with mapping the behavioral profiles of the suspects based entirely on their written output. The individuals capable of executing an abduction of this magnitude while simultaneously maintaining a cold, calculated digital dialogue with both the family and major media outlets almost always exhibit a profound degree of clinical narcissism and an absolute need for absolute control. When law enforcement agencies suddenly alter their public posture and dismiss these individuals as minor internet hoaxers, it strikes directly at the core of the perpetrator's psychological motivation. A criminal driven by the thrill of outsmarting an entire federal apparatus cannot tolerate being ignored or minimized by the media. Their internal pathology demands validation. This psychological vulnerability is precisely what the current federal strategy seeks to exploit, betting that the suspect's internal need for recognition will ultimately override their operational discipline, driving them to make the singular, catastrophic forensic error that will finally expose their true physical identity to the team of analysts waiting in the shadows. The fundamental operational timeline of this kidnapping plot reveals a series of severe structural anomalies that standard criminal enterprises almost never exhibit, pointing toward an early and catastrophic escalation behind the scenes. In authentic, profit-driven abductions, the primary objective of the criminal network is a rapid financial transaction designed to minimize their operational exposure and eliminate the logistical burden of holding a hostage. This is particularly critical when dealing with an 84-year-old victim who possesses severe documented medical vulnerabilities, requiring daily pharmacological management and specialized physical assistance. Yet in the Guthrie timeline, multiple days of absolute silence elapsed before the first concrete financial demand was ever transmitted to the family or law enforcement. This prolonged initial delay strongly indicates that the perpetrators did not possess the logistical infrastructure to maintain a long-term hostage operation, or far more dark, that the victim may have passed away within the opening hours of the abduction, forcing the captors into a prolonged state of tactical panic as they attempted to restructure their entire extortion strategy. This theory of early mortality is further supported by the complete absence of any verified proof of life throughout the entire duration of the public standoff. Demanding a multi-million-dollar payout understands that financial institutions and family legal representatives will never authorize the release of massive capital without definitive, undeniable confirmation that the hostage is alive and capable of being recovered. The fact that the perpetrators repeatedly escalated their financial demands from $4 million to $6 million while consistently failing to provide a single photograph, voice recording, or personal detail validating the victim's current status represents a fatal structural flaw in their leverage. Without proof of life, the extortion attempt becomes a hollow mathematical exercise, a reality that forces investigators to consider the highly probable alternative that the perpetrators were attempting to execute a financial recovery operation, while fully aware that they no longer possess the living asset necessary to fulfill their end of the bargain. From a forensic pathology perspective, if the victim did pass away shortly after being removed from her domestic environment, the environmental conditions of the Southwest present a very specific set of challenges and opportunities for recovery teams. In an arid, high desert landscape characterized by extreme temperatures and exceptionally low humidity levels, the traditional biological timeline of human decomposition is radically altered. Rather than undergoing typical rapid tissue degradation, a body concealed in a shallow desert grave or abandoned in a remote wilderness sector is highly subject to natural mummification. The intense heat and dry air rapidly evict moisture from cellular structures, turning the outer dermal layers into a hard, protective, leathery shell that preserves the underlying anatomical architecture for an extended period. This natural preservation means that even months after a disappearance, specialized medical examiners can utilize advanced forensic rehydration techniques, injecting specialized fluids back into the digital pads of the fingers to reconstruct the ridge patterns necessary to secure a definitive fingerprint identification. Furthermore, modern medical technology has inadvertently provided law enforcement with an unalterable, permanent internal tracking mechanism that completely bypasses the limitations of traditional biological degradation. Advanced cardiovascular pacemakers and artificial orthopedic implants are manufactured with unique, federally registered serial numbers that function identically to a vehicle identification number. These components are definitively mapped to an individual's central medical history and dental records, ensuring that even in a worst-case scenario where extreme environmental exposure or wildlife activity has compromised the primary soft tissue and skeletal structures, the recovery of an internal electronic unit provides an absolute, legally indisputable identification within minutes of arriving at a forensic laboratory. This reality ensures that no matter how deeply the perpetrators attempt to bury the evidence of their crime within the vast topography of the desert, the physical remains of the victim carry an indelible forensic signature that can never be truly erased or obscured. The technical logs of the victim's internal pacemaker have already provided the investigation with its most solid, unassailable physical baseline, effectively dismantling a wave of malicious public theories regarding the true location of the crime. Online commentators and skeptical media outlets circulated the narrative that the entire abduction was an internal domestic fabrication, claiming that the victim was never even present at her residence on the night in question. However, the automated digital telemetry of the medical device proves otherwise. The unit was actively synchronized with the home's localized wireless network up until the early morning hours, providing an undeniable digital breadcrumb that places her firmly inside the domestic perimeter. The data reveals a sudden, massive physiological spike in the victim's heart rate at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, followed shortly thereafter by a permanent disconnection from the household router. This precise electronic sequence paints a terrifyingly clear picture of a sudden, high-stress physical confrontation that culminated in the immediate removal of the victim from the operational range of her home network, establishing a definitive forensic window that anchors the crime squarely within the residence and exonerates the family from the accusation of a premeditated domestic disappearance. The internal bureaucratic friction generated by these competing forensic disclosures has completely paralyzed the operational command structure, creating an intelligence vacuum that has severely compromised the active field search. As the Federal Bureau and local sheriff's deputies continue their public backstroke over the validity of the digital evidence, the physical landscape where the victim is believed to be hidden remains largely unmapped and unsearched. This systemic failure was significantly compounded during the critical first hours of the crisis, when local command authorities made the controversial decision to flatly reject any outside assistance from specialized volunteer organizations. Groups like the United Cajun Navy, which possess extensive experience in large-scale wilderness tracking, mobilized their personnel and deployed an incident commander to the scene to conduct an immediate tactical assessment. Despite presenting a comprehensive, written operational blueprint that detailed their advanced civilian capabilities, including scent-specific cadaver dogs, thermal imaging aerial drones, and low-altitude fixed-wing reconnaissance aircraft, the organization was met with a rigid administrative wall, with local officials repeatedly stating that third-party assistance would not be tolerated under any circumstances. The strategic consequences of turning away an experienced civilian force multiplier during the golden hours of a violent felony investigation cannot be overstated. In any missing persons case, particularly one involving an elderly individual with severe medical dependencies, there exists an incredibly narrow physical window where a crime scene can be effectively processed before environmental factors permanently degrade the evidence. By stalling the integration of federal assets and simultaneously locking out highly trained volunteer search teams, local leadership allowed the primary physical perimeter to become utterly compromised. A crime scene is an organic, highly volatile entity. Once the immediate timeline is fractured, the surrounding terrain changes, weather patterns erase footprint data, and the forensic integrity of the area is permanently destroyed. The tragic reality of the Guthrie investigation is that no matter how much administrative pressure is applied in the coming months, the foundational physical evidence from those crucial early days has been utterly lost to time and operational mismanagement. This forensic contamination was not limited to the external desert perimeter. It manifested visually on the front lawn of the residence itself, where a complete breakdown in crowd control turned a highly sensitive crime scene into a chaotic public media circus. Photographic and video records from the initial days of the disappearance show a shocking influx of non-essential personnel, including local delivery couriers walking directly through the cordoned areas, while local deputies were still attempting to establish an initial timeline. Journalists and curious onlookers were permitted to approach the very edge of the residential structure, taking close-up photographs of sensitive surface anomalies and potential biological trace materials before they could be properly documented and harvested by a certified forensics team. This level of structural neglect effectively rendered any future trace evidence analysis highly suspect in a court of law, providing future defense attorneys with an absolute goldmine of cross-contamination arguments that could completely torpedo a prosecutorial effort before a jury is even selected. The ongoing evasion displayed by the federal director during international press briefings is increasingly interpreted by seasoned intelligence reporters as a desperate attempt to contain the fallout from this localized investigative disaster. It is highly probable that the Federal Bureau's non-committal stance was a direct response to a massive public relations blunder committed by local authorities who had prematurely blurted out unverified conclusions regarding the fraudulent nature of the ransom notes on a morning talk program. When the media subsequently descended on federal headquarters demanding a definitive clarification, the director was forced into a tight administrative corner. He could neither openly validate the local sheriff's erratic statements without compromising ongoing cyber surveillance operations, nor could he publicly brand a key local partner as incompetent. The resulting no-comment formula was a masterclass in institutional damage control, designed to shield the broader multi-agency task force from public ridicule, while internal analysts frantically worked behind the scenes to salvage what remained of the digital trail. Despite the recent attempts by official spokespersons to walk back their previous dismissive statements and suggest that the initial ransom demands are in fact being pursued with renewed vigor, the societal damage has already been decisively executed. The institutional flip-flopping has done absolutely nothing to quiet the aggressive digital factions that have weaponized this investigation for online engagement and sensationalist reporting. For the Guthrie family, the administrative chaos has transformed a profound personal tragedy into a permanent public trial, forcing them to navigate the unimaginable grief of a missing relative under the constant pressure of societal suspicion. As long as the official entities charged with delivering justice continue to project a narrative of internal conflict, shifting blame from local state jurisdictions to federal cyber units, the actual perpetrators of this complex crime remain entirely unpunished, comfortably insulated by the very bureaucratic dysfunction that was supposed to bring them to light.